Research and writing. How do we communicate the findings of our research? By the end of this session, you should be able to identify your worldview. In other words, find an answer to the question, what is your Weltanschauung? You should also be able to define your rationale for completing a research report. In other words, you should be able to answer the question, what is your appetite for writing? We should also be able to elucidate on how you actually put forth clear arguments in your research report. In other words, what is your rhetoric? Finally, you should be able to decide on how you intend to share your findings. Quo vadis, or where to. I present to you two figures, figure A and figure B. And then I ask you these four questions. First, which one is real? Figure A or figure B? And then I ask you, how can you know that what you have chosen is real? And then I ask you again, how can you be certain that what you have chosen is real? And finally, what judgments can you make about the value of the reality that you have chosen? That painting that I showed you is actually a painting from the south of Spain in Granada, and that's one of the fountains in the facade of the castles, the ruins of the castles that you find in Granada in the south of Spain. I wanted you to go through that exercise because invariably you may choose that what is real for you is the painting, or what is real for you would be the picture, or maybe you'll choose both of them as real in various ways of explaining it. But the point of that exercise is for you to determine what is your Weltanschauung. How do you view reality? So the four questions that I have asked you are actually very important when you start thinking about research. You need to ask yourself what your ontological views are. In other words, when you take a look at reality, how do you make sense of it? For example, if I ask you the question, what is student achievement? So some people might say, well, student achievement is through high stakes test scores, NAPLAN, or in the United States of America, the Scholastic Aptitude Test. If you define your reality of student achievement in that way, some people might say that you have a positivist Weltanschauung, a positivist perspective. In other words, what you find real is what is measurable. Scores are measurable. Test results are measurable. However, some might say that for them, student achievement is measured or depicted by happiness of the students, satisfaction of the students, participation of the students in the life of the school. Now, these other indicators of student achievement are very difficult to measure. In fact, there are no objective ways to measure them. Now, when you interpret these, one can say that you view reality in an interpretivist fashion. So you have, just as an example for this discussion, two contrasting viewpoints in making sense of reality. On something that is positivistic, measurable, and something that is not measurable, or what is referred to as interpretivistic. When you undertake your research, you need to find out how you view your reality. Because whatever your answer to that question is, for example, how you define student achievement, or how you define teaching excellence, or how you define the performance of schools, will determine the way that you investigate research. If you are more inclined towards positivistic approaches, then it might be best for you to pursue quantitative research because it's really very positivistic. But if you view these ideas from an interpretivist perspective, then it might be better to pursue research projects in the qualitative domains. Now, once you've determined what your ontological stance is or how you view reality, the next thing for you to determine is how you make meaning of reality. And this is called epistemology. If you are positivistic, then you are able to know that things are real by looking at things that are measurable. If you are an interpretivist, then in order for you to know that something is real, you're not necessarily limited by measurable things. You're open to notions, to variables that are very difficult to measure. That's making meaning of reality. It's only after you've straightened out what your ontology is and what your epistemology is do you actually go into the third step, which is methodology. That is when you make inquiries into reality. How can you be certain that the reality that you're pursuing is really authentic? Right? Also, if you're positivistic, then you look for measurable indicators to determine relationships between cause and effect. If you're interpretivistic, you will not be looking for measurable indicators. We'll take a look at perceptions of individuals, how they see, how they interpret, for example, relationships between teachers and student performance. That's the time that methodology comes in. This is one of the, I think, weaknesses of research methods courses that put methodology right at the beginning. Students should initially understand what their ontological perspectives are, followed by their epistemology, and eventually they then move on to methodological approaches. The fourth and also important component of your Weltanschauung, your worldview, is how you make value judgments about reality. This is also called axiology. What judgments can you make about the value of this reality? This is where ethics come in, right? Because it is important that when we pursue knowledge, we are ethical in doing this. We pursue it in an ethical manner. These 4 points consist your worldview, your Weltanschauung. The other question we wanted to find out is what is your appetite? I really refer to your appetite in relation to writing. This is from Gene Fowler, and he writes about writing. Writing is easy, all you do is stare at a blank sheet of paper until drops of blood form on your forehead. That's what he says. Jody Picoult, writer's block is having too much time on your hands. If you have a limited amount of time to write, you just sit down and do it. You might not write well every day, but you can always edit a bad page. You can't edit a blank page. Khaled Hosseini says, I don't outline at all. I don't find it useful, and I don't like the way it boxes me in. I like the element of surprise and spontaneity of letting the story find its own way. Barbara Kingsolver says that I tend to wake up very early, too early, 4 o'clock standard. I write a lot of material that I know I'll throw away. It's just part of the process. I have to write hundreds of pages before I get to page 1. Haruki Murakami says, if you only read the books that everyone else is reading, you can only think what everyone else is thinking. Interesting ideas to look at. Now, when you look at your appetite, you can either be concupiscible or you can be irascible. So, irascible appetites refer to appetite that well, it it can be satisfied after a certain degree of time. So you essentially you're patient. Concupiscible means, well, this is, I need to get it now. I need to get the gratification right now. So you have to determine yourself. How is your style of writing? Do you find it easy? Do you experience writer's block? Do you want to do outlining? Do you wake up early in the morning, or do you follow what Haruki Murakami does, whereas he reads books that are not usually read by others? Once you've determined what your appetite is, then you can structure the way that you write. You can start one day at a time. Some people write in spurts. Some people write systematically, one day at a time. So you need to determine how you are, and in that way you can really plan to do your writing. Because writing a research report, let's say a thesis or dissertation, is not a joke. We're talking about really huge amounts of words, which is really a compendium of your thoughts and your insights. That cannot be crammed. That has to be done properly, thoroughly well. We've identified our Weltanschauung, our worldview. We have reflected on what our appetite is in relation to how we write. And now we take a look at our rhetoric. And our rhetoric can be divided into three notions. One is ethos, the credibility of the source, either the speaker or the writer. So when we write, we need to take note of the credibility of what you write. And then logos. How do we employ logic to support the arguments that we are putting forth? Are we going to be using induction? That means from specific to general, or are we going to be using deduction from general to specific? And what is our pathos? How do we use motivational or emotional appeals without committing fallacy? How do we use this in order um, to promote vivid language, sensory details that will attract our reader, our audience, to be interested in our message and essentially or eventually read our paper? Let's explore ethos, right? Credibility in what in the way that we write. And these are some practical tips. Um, you need to be able to get sources that are of high quality and peer reviewed. Now, this particular slide you may have seen in earlier sessions, but it's good to repeat. Right? When you start looking for data to support your ideas, you need to use key terms, and then you need to also identify seminal works, works that have uh, reshaped an entire scholarly landscape. In education, uh, the work of Coleman, we just refer to as a Coleman report, that happened in the United States in the early 20th century, changed the way that people looked at race and education. That was a seminal work. Right? So there are other examples. Of course, the works of Piaget, the works of Vygotsky reshaped the way that we saw education. One particular work that influences me a lot is the work of Paulo Freire, a Brazilian scholar who talked about critical pedagogy. So his ideas reshaped the way that people looked at education from what he referred to as the banking concept, which some teachers still practice today. In other words, looking at kids and thinking that they're empty vessels, and our role as teachers is to invest, putting skills in them, and then these skills grow and flourish. Well, he disdains that. Paulo Freire says that's a wrong model of education, and I agree with him. He talks about the idea of critical pedagogy. So this is a seminal study in the field. Once we are able to, for example, possess a journal article which we think is really significant or relevant to our research, we explore the reference list or the bibliography. And in doing so, we identify opposing and complementing ideas in relation to our research topic, because this way it broadens and it makes us ready to know the various angles that are related to the topic that we're researching. We're not just looking at it from the pro side, the advantages, but we're also looking at it from the con side, what people have identified as disadvantages of that research approach or topic that we are exploring. So these are practical tips in exploring ethos. For example, I might be writing my paper, right? And then these are again practical tips in exploring ethos. And when I write my paper, I need to consult references. And when I encounter, for example, if I'm writing about student achievement, the work of Payne and Biddle, this particular work is highly cited. It's a controversial paper that has been written. So I make sure that when I read this article in relation to my project, I not only look at their perspective, but I also look at the perspectives of other people who have criticized their work. And there are many people who have criticized their work. And actually, their work is a criticism of earlier work, the work of the of the Stanford scholar Eric Hanushek. So Eric Hanushek also wrote a seminal study in the field of education. He was the one who talked about education as an economic production function, right? And because of what he said, people saw, scholars, practitioners saw that education could be a formula. Teachers plus school facilities plus budget equals good students. That's a simplistic way of describing the economic production function in schooling. So Payne and Biddle criticized that, and other people criticized their work. So you take a look at different perspectives in relation to a research topic that you're doing. This is exploring ethos, establishing credibility for what you're writing. Another practical tip is to make sure that you're on top of the references that you're using. It is a good practice for you to use referencing software, for example, EndNote. Right? It's very important because it systematizes the way that you collect your references. This is an example of how you would see EndNote if you're using it. You, when you're writing on your paper, you discover a journal article, you create a new reference using EndNote, and then when you intend to use that same reference in the subsequent pages of your article, you just basically insert it using the convenience of a referencing software like EndNote. If you have not been exposed to this, you could actually go to the library and sign up for free courses that provide you with the necessary skills in using EndNote or similar referencing softwares. The good thing about EndNote is that it can actually be linked to the web, to the World Wide Web. It really allows you to systematically collect references and cite them in a very convenient and accurate manner. Now, what does a quantitative paper look like? So the quantitative paper would be, this would be the typical outline. It has an introduction, and in the introduction it has a critical literature review, problem statement and purpose, definition of key terms. These are essentially generally accepted principles that I'm presenting here. And doing these, following this, helps establish, again, credibility of your research paper. After the introduction, you have the methodology section where you talk about the setting of the study. You talk about the research design, describing the variables, indicating, explicitly stating what the hypotheses are. Talk about the population sampling plan. You talk about the data collection procedures as well. And of course, this is followed by the results, a discussion, and a conclusion. So when you take a look at these components of a quantitative paper, these are the questions that they ask. What do you intend to, why do you intend to do in this study? That's your literature review. What educational themes are you going to study? That's your problem statement and purpose. Describe the context of your study. Are you going to use experimental, non-experimental, or mixed methods approaches? That's in your research design. Describe your population and sample as it relates to reliability and validity. It's very important when you write a quantitative paper. These components need to be present. The notions of reliability and validity. Data collection. Are you going to employ parametric or non-parametric analysis? How do you intend to undertake data collection and analysis? Again, these questions need to be addressed. And addressing these questions really helps establish the credibility of your research paper. What are your key findings? What are the results of the tests of hypotheses? What are the implications of the results? What are the limitations and areas for further research? So your quantitative paper, the paper that you're going to be submitting as one of the options for this particular module, ideally, when you write a paper, it should contain these components, and it should be able to answer the questions that are raised in relation to the components of a quantitative paper. Now, although this is not part of the scope here, because this is about quantitative research, it's still good to take a look at qualitative papers and how they look like. Again, these are generally accepted principles. So there's a critical literature review, problem statement and purpose, and definition of key terms. Similar to the quantitative paper, you explain why you intend to do this study in the critical literature review. What educational themes are you going to study? That's for the problem statement and purpose. And then you have described the context of your study. For qualitative papers, there is quote-unquote a methodology. It's not really methodology that is akin to what you find in quantitative research, because it's more open-ended. So you need to identify, are you going to use a case study, a narrative inquiry, grounded theory, phenomenology, or ethnography, designs in qualitative research. And you need to describe the central phenomenon. Why is it important? Describe your target respondents. And then you need to say something about how you will unpack the central phenomenon. How will you understand it? How do you establish trustworthiness? You take note that in qualitative research, reliability and validity are really not the terms that are used. Instead, what is used is trustworthiness. So how do you establish trustworthiness when you write findings of your qualitative research? In your discussion, you talk about insights that you have unearthed in relation to the central phenomenon, and then you talk about limitations and areas for further research. This is how qualitative paper ideally should look like, based on generally accepted principles, and it helps establish the credibility of your work. 3 notions that we need to remember in terms of pathos, right? Or how attractive or how appealing our writing of the report should be. We need to satisfy the 3 C's. Clarity. Is the argument clear? Your paper should have a very clear argument. Usually the problem that a lot of practitioners, students encounter is that their argument is not clear. And if their argument is not clear in their own mind, it is reflected in their writing. There needs to be a clear articulation of the research puzzle that comes from a critical analysis, manifesting familiarity with the subject matter. Having been a supervisor of many students, I always tell students, if there's no research puzzle, why bother to read a research project? There needs to be a puzzle. There needs to be a puzzle, and these puzzles usually come from a critical analysis, a literature review, which allows you to become familiar with the subject matter that you are studying. Comprehensiveness is the next C. Does the argument come from a comprehensive appraisal of the current state of affairs? Again, this is related to the literature review. You need to be exposed, and you need to manifest expertise with the most relevant literature. So good, really excellent research papers, excellent written papers, display this quality of comprehensiveness. They're able to take a look at all the possible facets, all the faces, in relation to a research issue or question that they're exploring. The final C is coherence. Do the methodological approach and findings coherently follow from the argument and the review of literature? Your entire paper should be coherent from the problem to the critical review to the methodology to the findings. They should be coherent. Well-defined and coherent research methodology. There's a logical flow of problem, methodology, and results. A very strong and clear narrative should be apparent, should be obvious when one reads your written report. So when you write, you need to be clear, you need to be comprehensive, you need to be coherent. This is practical tips in exploring pathos. Now, this is an example of applying rhetoric, where you incorporate ethos, logos, and pathos. Right? So you establish credibility by making sure that the outline of your paper follows generally accepted principles. Now, the article that I was mentioning earlier, Pain and Biddle, follows this generally accepted principles. So somehow they are able to establish credibility, right? And then when you take a look at the way that they structure their paper, they follow a logical flow. So again, that reinforces the strength, the robust, the quality of being robust of the written paper. And finally, pathos, the language that they use. Well, the Pain and Biddle article, I deliberately chose this because the language that they use is really provocative. If you take a look at this paragraph, you take a look at the last 5 lines, it says, previous reviewers have tried to reach such conclusions by aggregating results from the effort as a whole, but one cannot make a silk purse even out of many sow's ears. And unfortunately, their efforts have implied to the unwary that one should take the corpus of this largely flawed literature seriously. Again, the very emotionally laden phrase of largely flawed literature is used, Pain and Biddle. Then when they talk about their hypothesis, they're very, very clear. Our hypothesis, reading the last 3 lines of the second paragraph, were of course the net effects of both funding and poverty would be substantial and largely independent of one another. Again, this is a reinforcement of the key principle of the economic production function in education, which Hanushek introduced in the early 20th century. Right? So the language that they use, the pathos that they use, is clear and used in a language that that is supported by the data that they were able to obtain, and therefore it exudes confidence. This last paragraph, again, is an example of the shrewd application of pathos in the language of writing. So let's take a look at this. Nevertheless, our results speak clearly about the effects of poor school funding and child poverty in America. They suggest that both types of inequity affect student achievement in the United States, that such effects are largely independent of one another, that these effects are substantial, and that they are largely independent of the impact of other factors such as curriculum and race that may also affect achievement. So their findings are clearly stated, right? And they generalize, and they do this because of if you have a chance to read the paper, they are able to get a pretty good representative sample of their target. But as I mentioned, there are people who have criticized the work of Payne and Biddle, right? And we don't have time to talk about this, but when you have a chance to read this article, you can see this particular journal, Education Researcher, volume 28, number 6. In this specific volume, 28, number 6, one of the articles criticizes this work of Kevin Payne and Bruce Biddle. Quo vadis, now that you have knowledge of what your worldview is, and now that you have a knowledge of what your appetite is in terms of writing, and then you have been exposed to the importance of rhetoric, combining ethos, credibility, logos, the logical flow of your arguments, and pathos, the language that you use in order to become convincing, where to now? Quo Vadis, where do you go? Well, you can take a look at these websites like the hnet.org, because when you take a look at this, there are a lot of calls for papers. And if you're interested, you may want to submit your paper there so that it could be published, so that your findings are disseminated. It's important to do this because when you do that, you are able to join a community of scholars all over the world, and these scholars will be able to read your work and provide you with criticism. They will tell you whether you make sense, whether what you've identified is really fascinating, or they might even tell you that that's already been written before in a different context in a different country. So you may want to take a look at that. So you really benefit when you disseminate your findings and participate in a thriving and dynamic community of scholars. This is a Journal of Education Policy. This is a highly ranked journal. If your paper has something to do with education policy, you may also consider writing and submitting your paper for publication in these journals. This journal is recognized by the Educational Research Association of Australia, the ERA, and it's a highly ranked journal. It's based in the United Kingdom. Right, so you just go to Manuscript Central and you can submit your paper, also the good thing about this is that well, JEP has a very they get something like hundreds of papers in a year, and they only accept they get thousands, and they only accept 26, sometimes 38 papers in a year. So it's really very competitive. Um, what is beneficial though is that if your paper gets rejected, you're able to receive valuable comments from reviewers, peers, right, from different parts of the world who carefully read your work and will suggest different ways for you to improve your research outputs. For scholars, this is really part of the work that we do. We submit our publications to journals such as this, receive feedback. Hopefully these get accepted. If not, we incorporate suggestions and then submit it elsewhere. You may also want to take a look at this website. It's called Policy and Leadership Studies workingpapers.com. Working papers are also a good venue for your research outputs. When you submit something on a working paper, it's counted as a publication. This particular working paper is ISSN certified. It's an international certification. And what happens is that people are able to access your work. But then when your paper gets published, and before that happens, the editors of the PLS working papers provide you with valuable feedback. What happens is that once you get the feedback, you could send it out to other journals, and once it's accepted, the PLS working papers will say that, well, this working paper has been accepted in this journal, and they will have a way to direct readers to the new site. So in any way, what happens is that your work gets a lot of mileage, it's disseminated, and people from all over the world are provided the opportunity to read your writing and your research outputs. This ends our session on research and writing, how we communicate findings of our research. If you have any questions or clarifications, please do not hesitate to get in touch with me through the email that you find in this slide. Thank you.